This is Ukrainian Spaces, and we basically a project set up by Val and me to amplify Ukrainian voices and to decolonize some Ukraine conversations. And thank you so much, because this re-recording is possible through and thanks to the support of our listeners, because Ukrainian Spaces is 100% independent, listener-supported, and volunteer effort. And if you want to join it, please check out our Patreon space, which is called Ukrainian Spaces Together, and become our sponsor. And this is not a charity. Our sponsors get a lot of extra cool bonus stuff, like advanced announcements, transcripts, but most importantly, you get the opportunity to ask your questions and get a first row seat in during our broadcasts through Patreon space page or directly. So without any other delay, Nadia, hey, we're very happy to have you back again.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really glad to be to speak to you, and you're doing such a great job, and really happy to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, we have a ground rule for all Ukrainian spaces. Our featured Ukrainians have an opportunity to always introduce themselves first, without us pushing any labels or forcing people into any boxes. So please tell everyone else who you are, where you come from, and what your life has been like since the genocide started.
So my name is Nadia Dobrianska. I'm 34 years old, and in peaceful times I've been working as a project manager at Human Rights Center's MENA, and I was managing projects related to political prisoners of Ukraine in the occupied Crimea and the Russian Federation, and also a project related to promoting sanctions against Russians and their proxies in the occupied Crimea and Donbass for grave human rights violations. I also have a degree in Irish studies from Queen's University Belfast, and I have this connection with Ireland. So this was my past life. And then since the 24th of February, well, I'm from Kiev originally, and since the Russian invasion started, like the full-scale invasion, I evacuated my parents and some other family members to Ireland. And yeah, it's a bit, life is upside down, and we're based in Cork at the moment. So I'm minding the family, and also I keep working for Human Rights Center's MENA, as now I'm monitoring enforced disappearances and arbitrary abductions of Ukrainians in the occupied territory by Russians, as in for example, in Kherson region and in Zaporizhia region.
And you were also evacuated your cat as well, right? Am I right?
I did. Yeah. It was a very big endeavor and adventure, and I think that it cost me much more than it cost me to evacuate my family altogether. But it was worth it, because it's my brother's cat. My brother was at the moment in the territorial defense near Kiev, so I was really trying to do my best for the family.
Yeah, it's always very illustrative, and a lot of people, a lot of foreigners, a lot of Ukrainians for that Ukrainians never leave behind their pets, or try not to, and this is as part of their families as everyone else. And Nadia, and one of the important things that I want everyone else to know, how I came about your work, is actually coming from this question and this frustration that we often hear from our colleagues and mainstream media when we confront them that there is a lack of representation of Ukrainians. And they always say, well, it's very hard to find anyone Ukrainian speaking about Ukraine in English. And then I always remember you, because you're Ukrainian who has been reporting in Gaelic for Ireland. So I always kind of think of you, if there is a person who speaks in Irish language to Ireland, then definitely we can find Ukrainians who speak English and German and other more popular language in plenty to be represented on Western mainstream media. But tell us how it actually even happened that you are able to tell the stories in Gaelic.
Right. Yes. This is quite unusual, but you'd be surprised that I'm not even the only Ukrainian who speaks Irish. There is also another man. I lost the program on Radio Nagueltachta with him. I think that he lives in Germany, so there are even two of us. So yeah, I mean, I've been learning Irish for almost 4 years now, and I always had this love for the Irish language since I was a teenager. I was introduced to it by an English tutor that I was doing a language course with when I was in my 15 maybe or 16. He was from the north of England, and he introduced me to Irish and Scottish traditional music, and I heard Irish and I definitely wanted to learn it at some point. So yeah, but then over the course of the years I couldn't really find the way to learn it, so I took up Duolingo in 2018 and started learning Irish, and it went really well. And then I did 2 years when I was doing my master's at Queen's University Belfast. I did 2 terms in the language centre on the Falls Road, and then for a few years now I've been learning it with a tutor. So I didn't know that I had enough Irish when when the invasion started, and the Irish-speaking media discovered through my Twitter that I spoke some Irish, and they offered me to comment on the situation before the invasion in Irish, and I agreed. We did a few pre-recorded talks, and it worked out really well. And I've been speaking to Radio Nagueltachta and Radio Fáilte and other Irish-speaking media, and onto the Irish-speaking television, TG Cahir, for a good few months. And I'm surprised myself, to be honest.
That sounds absolutely incredible. And I wanted to ask you, since you've been working so closely obviously in Ireland and Irish, and seeing a lot of the conversations around Ukraine that have been happening, what has been most frustrating for you, both in terms of the way that people, maybe just even conversations, not necessarily media, have been revolving around Ukraine? What have been like some of the biggest frustrations you've had to deal with and like debunk certain myths in Ireland and in general in the West?
So in Ireland there are 2 media spheres. There is an English-speaking media sphere, and there is an Irish-speaking media sphere. And on one hand, like in the English-speaking sphere, I've most of the time what I was finding as something that I wasn't used to. I had to speak as a, like our girl on the ground. I'm a professional. I have 2 masters. I have political outlook. I qualify as political expert, but I've been asked questions. Are you worried? Are you scared? How did it go? All these, I was asked about emotions, and not just because I'm Ukrainian, but also I was thinking that I'm capable of more, and often the questions that I was asked were very limiting me to a very specific role, to say basically that I'm scared and worried. And I mean, I know this is how media, like especially Western media, works, but it was quite annoying, even though I knew that this is, this is the game, and I have to play it. I suppose I had to go on with the flow and say what I have to say, but I felt that I was capable of more. But in the Irish-speaking sphere, I somehow combine both roles, and I've been commenting as a political commentator and as a refugee, or as an evacuee, as I was evacuating my family. I was giving many, like on the 24th of February, I got I think 13 or 12 requests, and I gave I think 8 or 9 interviews to mostly Irish media, and I think I lost in communication like 3 of them. So I was looking back at it, it was so strange, because I was evacuating the family from Kiev and doing this along the way.
Well, unfortunately it happens all the time, and I'm super grateful for you to bring it up because we talk about this a lot. The way Ukrainian voices are often treated with this a bit colonial haze, especially for Western, especially for English language media. And it's very interesting that you point out the difference that you felt when it comes to English language coverage, Irish language coverage, and there's this colonialism that is present there with how they treat us and how they just basically give us space for emotions and then they move on to something more serious analysis done by other Western people. But in general, because when you have this a very unique bridge between experience of Ireland under British colonialism, so-called white-on-white colonialism, and very, in a way, similar experience that Ukraine has with Russian colonialism. Um, is it something you often think or channel or discuss also with the Irish audience about those similarities and colonial experiences that both our countries had?
Well, this is a big question about Irish as a former British colony and Ukraine as a former Russian colony. And well, I'm mostly speaking these days. I sometimes talk to have been giving talking on historical podcasts, and but mostly I haven't been asked on very broad popular media to discuss these issues. But basically, Ireland has this massive body of scholarship that was accumulated even before the post-colonial discourse, post-colonial studies emerged. So they've been discussing, historians have been discussing whether Ireland does qualify as a colony of the United Kingdom in the first place because of Ireland's proximity to the metropole, to England. And this is something that we see in the discussions as to Ukraine as part of the Russian Empire, that how can we qualify as a colony to if we are basically next to Russia and we're bordering with each other, and Ukraine wasn't exactly was an extractive colony as we would think of colonialism as an overseas exploited and subjugated nation, and usually which is far away, which is remote across the sea from the metropole. And also there is also always, or in many cases, racial difference involved. So in Irish history, there's this discourse that Ireland is an outlier. And I was writing an essay about this during my master's and my question was that maybe Ireland is an outlier compared to the countries of the global South and Africa. But on the other hand, looking at Europe, Ireland is far from being the outlier, because basically Ukraine is very similar, because we were conquered at about, quite closely. Ireland was conquered by the British rulers in 16th century. Also, Ukraine joined the union with Moscow in 17th century, and over time, Ukraine lost its privilege according to the treaty with Moscow up into the end of the 18th century. And similarly, Ireland, coincidentally, the union with the United Kingdom was established at the turn of the 18th century as well. And we were definitely far from being extractive colonies. So I would rather argue that there is a problem with the definition of colonialism nowadays that doesn't include countries like Ireland or Ukraine or Poland or Czech Republic, lots and lots and lots of landlocked former empires. And I know that, especially in public discussions on social media, theories, popular users, popular West Wing Twitter users are surprised that there was the word empire in the Russian Empire. So.
Absolutely. And this is, I also find it weird because when we're often, as Ukrainians, we're denied a space in conversations about colonialism by some folks just saying that, well, you're, white people. There is no such thing as white on white colonialism. And I find it extremely weird because once you remove the issue with skin color, everything else is quite similar. I mean, I'm not a historian myself. I'm not a huge researcher or scholar knowing all of it. But my journey of discovering Russian colonialism and framing it as Russian colonialism started exactly by comparing the information and the stories and the reporting from places like Ireland or Scotland, where they were talking about colonialism and how it manifested. And then I find it really bizarre that there is still such a big blind spot. I mean, in your personal experience, why do you think there is this blind spot? Is it because of race or because we're talking about, Western countries that were colonizers themselves, and it's very uncomfortable for them to admit that there's some sort of colonization still happening? I mean, how do you, as a Ukrainian, explain it to yourself?
Well, I think that this is, as a complex issue. I see, was returning to Ireland, that in the 19th century, Victorian era, the United Kingdom and British Empire, the Irish were racialized. So there was this debate about the Celtic race and the Anglo-Saxon race, even though both were white, and the fact that, but still, all the racial theory is building up on the previous era when racial differences were constructed and enforced. So in this way, Ireland was subjected to certain racialized treatment, which of course in 21st century we're a bit, it sounds baffling, like how could have been Irish seen as a different race, but history knows precedents like that. And my biggest, I would say that the biggest reason why the colonialism of the Russian colonialism is falling out completely, from the colonial theory, is just simply the Iron Curtain. That's my take. That while post-colonial theory was emerging in the second half of the 20th century, everything that was going on in the Soviet Union was behind the Iron Curtain, and the news that were filtering out into the world were controlled by the Communist Party, and it was used to, accordingly, to build the image that they wanted to, because there would be no international, independent international reporting of the Soviet Union. So the image that was depicted by the communist rule of the Soviet Union was this anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist view. They were providing a lot of help to the what at that time was known as third world countries, back in the day. So there was this big image of the Soviet Union being definitely not colonial, which was exactly the opposite of true. And there is also this, one of the scholars of post-colonial theory wrote that there's this prejudice in post-colonial studies towards the sea. So if the empire was maritime, then that's definitely colonialism. If this was a landlocked empire or continental empire, as the Russian Empire, then all of a sudden there's this gap, and which is very easy to bridge, in fairness. And I hope that over time it will be bridged, because colonial theory that doesn't encapsulate Europe and Asia as continents, because of that, it doesn't meet, is no good. I mean, what's the point?
It's ridiculous.
Do we apply it only to certain continents? Well, that's grand, but maybe we should then call it not post-colonial theory, but maybe post-colonial theory pertinent to certain continents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often compare, so to say, notes on on racist treatment of Ukrainians and Eastern Europeans with my friends of color. Some of, for example, Tyrell Star is going to be one of our featured honorary Ukrainians on the show. But we often compare, and when you list the experiences that you had as a Ukrainian and your racist treatment by Russians, everything is literally almost the same apart from skin color. So of course, this is not identical experience for people of color that face a much harsher discrimination because it's so easy to spot them, right, and oppress them. But for Ukrainians living within the Russian colonial empire, there were different level of racism, not based on skin color, but on any other things, the way we look, the way we talk, but it definitely was and feels like racism for us, at least within these, that environment.
And that's the thing, as long as we acknowledge and understand the intersectionality of every single issue and topic that we talk about, and the fact that different things affect different people differently because of who they are and so on and so forth, I think we're totally in our right to claim some of these concepts and in explaining the way that we have been treated, because also our region is not this black box of nothing, it's not just Russia versus the US. It's not this, dichotomy between two massive powers. There's actually a lot of history that has been happening in between, not just to Ukraine, right? We keep talking about it all the time. Maksym, you keep talking about it all the time. The Soviet Union was also also the Russian Empire, not like a place of homogenous kind of place with one type of person, one type of religion, and so on and so forth. And I do think that not being able to describe things the way that we are describing today just means that people miss that as a point in explaining what's going on today.
Not to say that the Russian colonial empire is not racist. Of course it is. It's rooted in white supremacy, and maybe Ukrainians as survivors of Russian colonial rule might be, predominantly white. But for example, people in Central Asia or indigenous nations that are still under Russian colonial rule survive through genocides and is still to the date extremely, extremely racist treatment. But Nadia, I wanted to ask you about one parallel that you also mentioned very often that we have similar with Ireland, is Irish Great Famine and Ukrainian genocide, Holodomor, which was Moscow-made artificial famine to exterminate Ukrainians. I know that you often bring that parallel. Is it something that hits home in Ireland also quite close? And how do people react to it? And whether you find, what kind of similarities you find between the two?
So the Irish famine took place in the 1840s, and Ukrainian famine in 1932-33, and to a certain extent, there are certain parallels, like in the way that the famine devastated the population of the nation. Like Ireland, before the famine, there were 8 million Irish people on the island, and they lost 1 million died, and 3 emigrated. And Ireland never psychologically recovered. They still haven't recovered the population of pre-famine Ireland, and it's been more than 150 years since the famine, and it's quite striking. And I think at the moment, on the island, with not taking into consideration Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, there are still around less than 6 million on the island. And it's really like the famine really changed because this in Ireland, because it affected the poorest, the Irish farmers who were struck by the potato infection that really destroyed the crops and the poorest, the Irish farmers were relied on potatoes for sustenance, and they didn't have enough money to buy other food that was at the time was exported out of Ireland. So there were relief measures. So it was really a huge tragedy. And for now, Ireland historians don't argue that this was genocide by intentional, but effectively it was huge negligence of the British rulers that was justified by the liberal economic mode as in free market, and the market would regulate itself. So in this way, it's slightly different. It's different from Ukrainian famine, where food was literally extracted from the farmers, and they were intentionally left to die by the Stalin's rule. But the sense that the state basically was guilty is similar. And for the Irish, the famine is still a painful thing that is ringing still close to home and still painful. Like, for example, I find it really striking that the Irish eat very little fish, and supposedly historians of food, well, there is an argument that before the famine they ate more of the fish, but somehow there was this watershed that didn't change since the famine. And for Ukrainian farmers, the famine was absolutely devastating. Like, it basically destroyed Ukrainian village as we knew it, and the backbone of Ukrainian nationalism and the popular nationalism and popular resistance. That so many, 4 million Ukrainians died. So the thing is that
and you were talking about which I find fascinating, the similarities between how Irish people talk about the famine and Ukrainians' families as well.
Yes, so I was really exploring comparing memory of the Irish famine and memory of the Ukrainian famine, and it was really interesting because the Irish famine happened so many years ago, and so there's this big collection of papers in the National Folklore Archive when children of the third generation from the famine were interviewing their grandparents about what they heard from their parents by the famine. So if you're following me, and so I'm the third generation from the Ukrainian famine, and I was interviewing my own grandparents about the famine. So I was really struck by things that the similarities in the memory. For example, so when you ask when you're talking to the Irish person about the famine, they probably will say, well, it wasn't as bad in my village or in my area than it was in the others. And I definitely heard that in Ukraine many times. Or, for example, nobody died in my family. That's what an Irish person would say, and I definitely know this from my family and from some people, from other people that I've heard interviewing their families, like that somehow. So probably we are children of survivors, obviously, but on the other hand, there could be a lot of shame involved in how the information about the dead family members during the famine has been passed on through the generations. Because basically, in Ireland, famine was associated with poverty, and in Ukraine, there wasn't this strong connection. But then becoming a victim of such a huge, dreadful, massive event, it leaves this trace of shame. And there's also the thing that the devastation of the Irish language was also associated with the famine. And Irish people after the famine, because the farmers were often, and poor would often be the Irish speakers, and ever since they stopped teaching their children Irish so that they get better opportunities in their lives. And I'm just really thinking, to what extent was this the part of the plan of, Stalin's plans of destroying Ukrainian farmers was this, how far can we go in arguing that destroying Ukrainian farmers to a big extent entail destruction of the Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian culture? At the Irish experience, I'm thinking that maybe, it could have been intended too.
Yeah, I come from a family that survived through Holodomor in southern Ukraine, and southern and eastern Ukraine were one of the heavily hit by genocide of Holodomor. And to the date, I mean, you realize that the majority of those villages, they were all speaking Ukrainian, and the impact that it had on the whole region that is now predominantly Russian speaking. There is even research kind of trying to bring parallels how that region became predominantly Russian speaking, and that red line goes through that genocide more often. And yeah, and even in our family, we were never able to extract that information from our grandparents. It was like I was too young for investigative journalism, but it was in sort of investigative journalism because you kind of learn in the school that every fourth, fifth Ukrainian died, and you try to compare it with the notes inside your family, and you ask your grandmother, but what happened, who died, and how you were affected, and they were very often secretive or just dismissive, trying not to talk about it, and only later you learn that basically they spend most of their lives trying to hide that information because, I mean, unlike in Ireland, being associated with a Holodomor as a survivor could give you hard times just succeeding in life in totalitarian state. And this is something they really wanted to avoid.
Yeah. I know we're sort of running out of time, but I wanted to ask you a question that we ask everyone. And I'm also so glad that you mentioned the sort of transition of trauma between generations, that it all passes down and makes us who we are. And, in some instances, even influences the way that events happen in the next iteration of, flare-ups of violence and so on and so forth. But I wanted to ask you, what does it mean to be Ukrainian for you? And it doesn't have to be connected, obviously, to trauma, but anything you feel like sharing with us.
Right, that's a very challenging question, to be honest. So, on one hand, I sort of have this strong link to Ireland that is really nourishing me at the moment. I mean, I had it for a few years, good few years now. But I think that during the war, I can rely on this sense of home away from home in Ireland because of the connection that I've been building over the years, and this is something that really supports me as a Ukrainian, being far from home, but sort of among friends that I've not just specific people that are my friends, but because I've been studying Irish history and culture and language, and I find myself that, sort of embedded in the fabric of Ireland that's how I like to think about it. And yeah, back in Ukraine, after I came back from doing my studies in Ireland, I had this bit of sense of being a stranger at home, and in Ireland I was a bit at home in a strange place. And as to being Ukrainian, I find that I just am who I am. I was basically indoctrinated in this broad Ukrainian nationalism, like old school, like not the one where you have to hate other nations, but my father really brought me up thinking about Ukraine, that it's important that we have a nation, that we have our language, we have our culture. And probably I never had the courage to have to fight for it, but I'm defending it in the ways that I can, being as a Ukrainian, speak as a Ukrainian person speaking to the world in ways that I can about Ukraine and about its value as a nation. And I'm really proud of being part of Ukrainian community, where I think that we've developed such a broad political and inclusive concept of Ukrainians since the war, and even since Maidan, since 2013, and since the Russian, especially since the full-scale invasion 3 months ago, that it doesn't matter what's your background. If you want to be Ukrainian, so be it. Go on. It doesn't matter what your beliefs are, or what's your skin color, or the languages you speak. If you want to be Ukrainian, yeah, you're welcome. And this is really, I'm really inspired by this fact, and that the old school nationalism merged and got molded into this modern day nationalism, if you like.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is powerful and very true, probably for absolutely everyone who has been on this show, and everybody always say that mention set of values. And I really super 100% relate to what you're saying. As someone who is not ethnically Ukrainian, who was born in Ukraine, but for many, many years had no connection to the country or identity until I connected, and it was more of a choice because of set of values, because Ukraine is about values first, not this 19th century bullshit about blood and land and whatnot. So yeah, thank you so much. I mean, as we say to everyone who comes on Ukrainian Spaces, you're free to come back and claim it at any point with any topic you'd like to talk about, to explain, to vent about. This is your space, and we're so extra super grateful that you spent additional time re-recording this. So thank you for that. Дуже дякую for that as well.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really honored and proud to be part of, to have joined the community of Ukrainian Spaces, and really appreciate her work. And I just can't believe that we have to explain all this to all these people,
Yeah.
And I'm delighted that
sure.
That you've built this community where you are doing this so well. And yes, I'll be really happy to be back at some point to contribute to our boosting Ukrainian voices.
Please do. Okay, thank you so much for everyone else listening. Please, after you finished listening, please rate this, comment this, because it does help. And algorithms on Spotify and Apple Podcasts work exactly like that. So by doing that, you will help Ukrainian voices to trend. And also don't forget that if you like all of this, you can support us through Patreon, which is called Ukrainian Spaces Together. And our sponsors get a lot of extra bonus stuff there. But most importantly, you have this opportunity to ask questions to our guests and leave comments. We always love that. And after this show is over, go on Twitter, on Instagram, use the hashtag Ukrainian Spaces to claim it, especially if you're Ukrainian, not only to suggest us topics and Ukrainians to feature, but if you're Ukrainian and you want to share some experience or your perspective, please also do that. We always love to quote that. Meanwhile, that's it. Apart from one thing, and it is Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.
Bye, guys.